us about the painting that self-destructed when he was auctioned off?
That was in the news just recently. I didn't.
That was Banksy.
Yeah, and,
He had built in a shredder like
Yeah,
years
to the
before
frame.
when he.
but did we discuss that in class? I don't think so.
The writer David Fox.
So, you had a nice break. You feeling any better?
I actually, despite my, brain hiccups, I feel a lot better than I did earlier. So it's-
Did you try eating food?
I always eat food.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's a given. It's not
So-
something that can be solved with food.
So, part of what we were talking about earlier was something we're looking at now, committed to the flames. What the heck is David Hume talking about? Well, so David Hume is the end of the chain of British empiricists. So he's kind of like the ultimate result of that, in a sense. I mean, he brings us to the most skeptical conclusion of that. And if you remember, I started with Francis Bacon and Hobbes, but really the British empiricists officially start with Locke, because John Locke comes up with the problem of empiricism, and that is that all of our phenomena that we experience is kind of mediated by our senses. So we're never actually seeing the objects in themselves. We're only seeing what they look like to us, right? And that's pretty acceptable all the way through now. Still today, we realize that we've got a human perspective on things, and so what we can see of the universe is what humans can experience. We've talked about this. So his critique, though, is not about human knowledge in general. It's more about the specific philosophers that think that they know stuff. And what he's basically saying, committed to the flames, is if their theories are not testable in some way, then it's nonsense. And it's only if you can actually check and see if what they're saying is true or false, then it's worth paying attention to. Otherwise, it's not. It's just nonsense. So just committed to the flame. So he's not saying burn books. He's basically arguing that those folks are full of. My mom used to say soup. It was only when I grew up that I realized soup was probably her metaphor for something else. It started with S. Had the same number of beans, full beans. Okay. That works.
Oh, no, I said BS.
Oh, that too.
BS.
That too. That's a special
Nicer
type
way
of.
of saying.
That's a special type of it.
Mm.
In any case, so that's really his article, and it merges then through others up until we get to Kant. So in a sense, we're really looking at Kant in this particular picture here, and we have a second occasion when we'll talk about that. But if we think about Immanuel Kant, well, let me first talk about Hume a little bit, because that's he's considered by some to be the greatest British philosopher, but that's odd because he's actually Scottish. So it depends on what I guess you mean by British. If you're including Scotland as part of that, that's fine. But he is Scottish.
What's the significance of the headgear in the photo there?
I don't know. I mean, there's lots of paintings of him. That's Hume's tomb. It's in the cemetery. If you go up the castle in Edinburgh till you get all the way up to the top, and then from the castle, you have to kind of climb down. You have to go up to go down, and this is the very bottom corner of it. In fact, this is a statue of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln over here.
I have actually been to the castle in Edinburgh, and I did not know about that.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. That would, I mean, I've only traveled there via my Oculus Rift, so.
I was actually there, and I saw the military tattoo parade, and I walked the Royal Mile and all that stuff.
This is in the cemetery that's right there, looking down from the castle. You can see this cemetery that kind of goes out to a point. Can't really park close to it. The street, there's no parking on the street where there's like a gate and a path that you could go up to go down to this. But with my Oculus Rift, I could like walk the whole path and see this from lots of different views and so on. And the architect that made this was a good friend of David Hume and Adam Smith. And
Adam Smith, who wrote the treatise on economics?
Yes, they were best friends.
Hmm.
So actually there's a book that I just got, that I just started reading. Unfortunately, when you're reading like 5 or 6 books at once, you don't get very far in any one of them.
Why do you read so many at the same time?
I have commitments, all sorts of. I have to finish Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, by Sunday.
Like the biography?
Yes.
I
With
know
Chernow.
Brother's all about that.
The
Oh,
one
yeah,
that-
he loves that. Yeah.
Yeah.
that-
I have to
that's
finish
favorite.
that by Sunday, and he's still on the island. He still hasn't gone to the mainland yet. So I've got a lot of reading to do tomorrow. I'm gonna have to scan it, that's all there is to it. But so, it's, the book is called The Infidel and the Professor. I just got it. It was thanks to Amazon. So they're best friends. It shaped modern thought. It's kind of interesting. So once I get to read through it, I'll let you know what I thought of it. Maybe if we're still meeting. Who knows? But and also, by the way, I already saw that there was a big dispute between Hume and Rousseau. So that's kind of interesting. They're contemporaries, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Hume, pretty interesting. And the way we might even imagine the problem, the way Kant imagines it, has to do with what he calls the a priori. So a priori, which I can talk about, because that's interesting.
They talk about that in, there was another reading, one of their previous readings, they were talking about.
The a priori.
Yeah, I was pronouncing it wrong in my brain.
Oh, well,
I put a priori.
that's pretty close, actually. There's no official correct pronunciation of any word. Because if you talk correctly, you sound like this, that depends on where you're from. I've done that before, my sketch on this. And that, I love how the British say their endings, they always come out with an R. Like Toshiba, Toshiba. So, but unfortunately, then, whenever I see the word Toshiba, I immediately think of the British pronunciation Toshiba, because of a friend of mine who died, Brian Davies, and he had a British accent, and he had a Toshiba. So it's kind of interesting. But a priori literally is Latin, and all it means is to the first. Is to or toward, and priori, or it could also be from, depending on whether you're going or coming. So from the first, and over history has meant different things in conjunction with, should I do it this way? How should I do it? No, I'll go this way. A posteriori, which I think is the harder one to say. That's easy though when you think of it as, well, posterior, you know what that is. We have those, although, I don't know about you, but mine has a crack in it. Sorry. Would you like to see something really hilarious for a minute?
Not
I don't
if
know.
it's a, no, this is a trap, this is a setup, no, no.
I know, isn't this bad? It's really bad. You don't want to see a picture of this. I made spaghetti the other night. I decided to call it spaghetti paparazzi. Because I took a picture of it. So there.
Oh, I get it, it just wasn't that funny.
Yes, I understand. It's my dog. Oh, come on, where is it? It should be here any second.
You know, I think
Here
in
it
that
is.
still photo, I could see the dog shedding.
I need a new bum. Mine's got a crack. I can see in the mirror a crack at the back. Did I do it on the slide or on the banister inside? Or when I jumped my BMX? Or with the fat that happened next? Of course, the fat. That's what blew my bum apart.
Crave loves like body humor right now.
Pardon?
My kids, they're all about. They would think it's
Split,
Well, you get the idea.
yeah.
You can go.
split the thing clean in two.
She's funny.
Now I wonder what to do. I need a new one. A green one or a blue one. A fat one or a thin one. A wood one or a tin one. Why not an artifact tub? One not to be forgotten, with watercolors on the top and a mural on the bottom.
I'm sure the pictures are part of what's making this hilarious, and of course I have.
Aurelia spotted, purple dotted, a bum with colour, a bum with flair, a bum as bright as I dare to wear, a bum as bright as his underwear,
Oh well,
or maybe an alien's bum.
you get the idea. Sorry, that's just hilarious.
Wow.
Okay, so
I feel both happier and dumber simultaneously, and it's okay.
is that my fault? I'm not sure. I'm glad either way. However, okay, so a priori before, a posteriori after, or behind, or however you want to do it. So obviously Aristotle didn't refer to them this way. This is the Latin translation of whatever it was that he did say. But so basically he referred to the priority, as, well, these are the premises, and the posterior is what comes after it, the conclusion, basically, right? And that pretty much stayed the way things were through the Middle Ages and so on. But once we get to Kant, the a priori becomes something very specific, and the a posteriori too, but the a priori is the important one, because if we kind of put up a grid here, with the a priori is one thing, of course the a posterior is the other. then we have analytic, and we have synthetic. So analytic is where Aristotle, if you remember, he has the square. So this is Aristotle's square of, well, I'm going to go tradition. We showed you this before. We looked at this before. So there's the outline. So if we look at the square, notice that both of these are universals, and as universals, they're like definitional of whatever the categories are that you're defining. Right? All horses are animals. It's part of your definition of a horse, right? So those are universals, but that also makes them analytic, in the sense that once you have those, and you've defined the horse and all its characteristics, in a sense, you know what a horse is. That's what it is, right? So you can do analysis from that on what a horse is, right? But a particular horse, these are synthetic instead of analytic. That is that they're basically new information. So now I know something specific about that horse. Right? That horse is a mare, right? So I don't get that kind of information from the definition of horses. I have to have something specific about an existing horse that I'm looking at that gives me that kind of information, that that particular horse is this kind of horse, etc. Right? So this is synthetic information. So if you take the square, you've got analytic and synthetic information. These two are analytic, these two are synthetic, right? Now the question that Hume seems to have posed for philosophers, for metaphysicians, is that in order for me to learn something, to know something, I first have to have experience, phenomena. So incoming phenomena. So I start off with synthetic information, right? And once I experience something, I've now had that experience. So I have a synthetic a posteriori. I've had that experience. I've seen a horse. Wow, I've seen a horse. I'm so impressed. That's 4 legs, head, etc. Did I ever draw a picture of a horse? It's actually not a horse, it's a picture of a horse, etc. See, I'm a great artist. Depending on the time, the horse can be kind of draped over a table or whatever. Depends on your art period.
I recognize your style
Dada
from
or whatever.
cave paintings.
Okay, so since I've had an experience of a horse, so there. Thanks to that a posteriori experience, right? I now have analytic a posteriori knowledge. So I've had the experience, and now I can plug this in and I understand the definition better of what a horse is. And so before I go out to the farms again, I now have a priori analytic information. information that enables me to identify, oh, that's a horse, that's a cow, etc., right? How do I know? Well, I know what cows and horses are because I have information that enables me to know ahead of time what kinds of things I'm about to experience, right? A priori analytic information, right? So I can have analytic a priori information, I can have analytic a posteriori information, I can have synthetic a posteriori information because I've had the experience. What Hume says you cannot possibly have is new information about something before you experience it. So I can't know what I'm going to see when I go and look at the farm tomorrow that's going to be new. I mean, I've been there, I know what the farm has looked like before, what kind of animals were there, what the people will say, you know, that I've had that experience, but I don't know what's going to be there for me tomorrow. That would be a priori synthetic information. That's logically impossible. You can't have it. But David Hume says all philosophical theories are an attempt to give you the synthetic a priori to anything that exists. That's what metaphysics is. Metaphysics is telling you what must be the case before you experience it. New experience before you have it. That's impossible. You can't have that. Which, for example, we cannot take Plato or Aristotle into a laboratory and test to see whose theory of knowledge is true. There's no test that you can make to do that, right? Which, remember, committed to the flames, you can't test it, right? It's untestable. By the way, there's a famous philosopher who's not really famous enough, actually, whose name is Karl Popper. You ever heard of him?
No.
See? Told you. He's famous, but not famous enough. And he should be more famous than he is, and the reason for it is because he's, as you see, the greatest philosopher of science. So if you're trying to figure out how empiricism changed, thanks to Karl Popper. By the way, he was from Vienna. So kind of close to where Wittgenstein was also from. Except while Wittgenstein was rich, Popper was poor.
The Popper was poor, really?
Yep.
Okay.
It's not a joke, it's true, he was poor. Well, they say upper middle class parents, but pretty sure he was actually, he always compared himself to Wittgenstein and said he was poor, etc. But in any case, what's neat is about his books, and this is all about philosophy of science, the problem of knowledge, that if you have a science theory that's not testable, then it's nonsense. But the way science works is not by figuring out that a theory is true, and rather which theories are not the case. So it's like how we get rid of theories. So instead of trying to figure out what's true, you try to figure out what's false. That makes sense? I'm looking for, I've not been on this page before, I should have. It looks really good, actually. So that's not going to actually help. How come it didn't say anything about his books? It did. It must have just not been like a list. Philosophy, background, science, rationality. Where are his books? that's terrible. I don't see a section saying these books, which was what I was looking for.
I bet you'd come up on Amazon.
Hey, what a great idea. So, the poverty of historicism, I have that one. The logic of scientific discovery, the open society, that's really important. Nobody reads it though. Aren't there more? Ah, okay, thank you. One of the reasons why his books did not get more popularity, by the way, is because they were all in German and didn't get translated over until much later.
Mm.
So that's one of the problems with it. However, the main trick is this is essentially where science is today as far as how knowledge works, and that is that we don't use science and say, here's a theory, and we test to see if it's true. Instead, we use Popper's theory and test to see if it's false. So, that might sound confusing, but I wonder why I'm not more clear on that. I need to practice that, that's for sure. Sorry about that. Next time I do this class, I'll be better on Popper. I'll prepare myself better. Okay, so the end result of this, and I guess you can't see this very clearly, especially not with the camera, because I have the leg off, is that metaphysics is impossible. You cannot do metaphysics because metaphysics is an attempt to come up with a synthetic a priori, which is logically impossible. You can't do it. So therefore metaphysics is impossible. So then Kant, who wakes up from his dogmatic slumbers when he reads David Hume's work. It's a famous line. I'll give it to you here. Kant wakes from his dogmatic slumber. Not a slumber party. It was the remembrance of David Hume, which many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the fields. So Hume woke Kant from his dogmatic slumber. So let's take a specific example. I think I mentioned before that David Hume pointed out we can't trust our memories because our memories can fail us. So causality, where does causality come from? Have I talked about this? Did I do the billiard balls experiment for you? Talk you through it? Okay, so David Hume talking about cause and effect, looking at billiard balls. I'm lined up 8 ball. Actually, that's not billiards,
Pool.
that's pool, right?
Different.
And he played billiards, but so it's me instead of you, right? So I'm lined up at the 8 ball with the cue ball, and I take a shot, perfect shot, sink the 8 ball after calling it. That's exactly what I would do. I could replicate that whole thing by setting them up exactly. It's a good table, not having a 6.6 or anything, so I could duplicate that. And if everything is set up exactly, I could replicate my experiment and sink the 8 ball the exact same way. And we might say that this is cause and effect, right? And we would traditionally say that the effect was necessarily going to happen because of the cause. There was a necessary connection between the cause and the effect, right? That's the way we would talk, right? And by the way, that's why Aquinas can point out that this movement necessarily was caused by, and that was caused by, and that was caused by, but it can't go on ad infinitum, so there has to be a first cause, and that first cause is God. So that's why you could say things like, well, God can't have a body, because bodies can be moved and God can't be moved, etc. Right? You know, so from this kind of necessity, we could argue characteristics, say, of the first mover. Right? It's not moved itself, but it moves. It's the reason why everything else moves. Well, David Hume points out that I could be aimed at the cue ball, hit the cue ball right as I did before at the 8-ball, but just before it hits the 8-ball jumps up in the air and goes, "Woohoo, you can't get me!" And the cue ball goes, "Hey, you can't do that," and rolls underneath and scratch. So the cause was all the same, but the effect is totally different. That I can imagine it being different. That possibly, though, is because I've seen movies like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and I went into a tune all of a sudden. But the thing is, I can imagine it. And if the necessity between the cause and effect was such that it was necessary, and I can imagine something else happening, I ought not be able to imagine something else happening if there's necessity in that relationship. So what does that mean? It isn't necessary. There's other possibilities. So it isn't logical necessity that is the necessity we're talking about in the cause and effect. So where does the necessity come from? It comes from our having had the experience multiple times that if I do this, that happens. If I do this, that happens. It always works that way. But guess what? My memory can fail me. And my argument is based on my memory of past events. But I can't trust my memory. I might be having a dream, thanks to Descartes, right? You know, so I don't really have grounds for saying this is absolutely connected, this cause to that effect. It's, as a matter of fact, necessity. As far as I'm concerned, it's my memory. So that doesn't give me a guarantee. In fact, who's to say that any causes have any effects whatsoever? In fact, when we go back and look at Aquinas' argument, it says this is moving, it had to be moved by something else. David Hume can ask, and does, in his arguments on natural religion, because it's nature, we're looking at the cosmos, right? How do we know that now isn't the very beginning of time? Strictly speaking, we, of course, practically will say, well, wait a minute, I was born in New Jersey, well, not in New Jersey, but in Penn Presbyterian. I was just conceived in New Jersey. I know exactly where I was born. Well, I know where I was conceived. I know my dad wrote his memoirs, told me, and it included the paper. He actually wrote them on the paper from the hotel where they stayed for their honeymoon, and he explained what they had for dinner, and the musician that played my mom's favorite because, and all their, he wrote down the songs that the musician played when they retired, and he put air quotes around the word to the bed at 9 o'clock, and in the one postcard of the hotel he pointed, we are here, and so I know what window that was, where,
frankly.
and you get the idea. So practically speaking, I have this memory of my conception and all that sort of. I remember looking, going down that long tunnel. You remember that? Do you remember? Oh, you're also rolling along. It's kind of a split memory of that stage of my development. all sorts of events happen after that. It gets confusing for a while. But then there was me, you know. And I could see my mom the next day smiling on the boardwalk because they bought a camera and took a picture of my mom. They didn't take a picture of my dad. Why the heck? Well, so in any case, she's sitting on the boardwalk in Ocean City smiling. So I know I'm a blasticist there. So actually, but practically speaking, Hume wasn't trying to say we should doubt all of that stuff. But what he was criticizing was the philosophers that think that they've actually proven anything, because they haven't. Because our memory we could be living in the Matrix. David Hume loved that movie. Well, he died in 1776, which, by the way, is an easy year to remember because 1776, everybody knows that was such a great year for Pinot Noir. We all remember it, right? And Hegel was born in 1770. And Kant started reacting to Hume in the 1780s because he started writing the critiques, the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, the critique of judgment. And when no one could figure out what the heck he was talking about, because he was trying to reply to this problem, he had to rewrite some of the critique of pure reason, and he called it the Prolegomena. Read this first. Now, if you're going to have metaphysics in the future, you're going to have to answer David Hume. And so how do we get around this problem of not being able to have a synthetic a priori? And so Kant agreed with Hume, agreed with the way Hume set up the problem, but said he didn't actually go far enough. It's even worse than Hume pointed out. However, there was a solution. And the solution is that we can transcend our phenomenal experience. So all of our experience, remember British empiricism, all of our knowledge is based on our phenomena, our experience, right? Well, David Hume didn't go far enough because he didn't argue, well, what must be the case in order for us to have phenomena? And so we get this marvelous response by Kant. It says, okay, so we have phenomena. Phenomena, by the way, the word means a lamp. So in Greek, phene is a lamp or a flashlight, or the British would call it a torch, right? And if you're walking around in the dark, the only light that you get to see anything by is the torch that you bring yourself, right? The lantern you bring with you. So I can only see or experience anything because of my own senses. So it's all phenomena. So I see it because of my own lantern that I'm carrying, right? And so phenomena is what I experience. But in order to have it, there has to be things out there that I'm experiencing. Locke says there has to be, the things in themselves, right, that I'm experiencing. So the thing in itself except Kant's German, so this is das Ding an sich, which is kind of fun. You can use that at parties, by the way. Which you could also call noumenon, by the way. Das Ding an sich. So there has to be actual things out there, because I'm experiencing them as phenomena, right? And there also has to be a self. That's experiencing things. He agrees with David Hume that we can't actually see the things in itself because I'm experiencing my phenomena, right? And I can see myself, which David Hume convinces us. You know, you're the subject of your experience. As the subject, you can never actually see the subject of your experience because the subject is the subject that's having the experience, right? So, not fast enough. I'm going to see myself. Watch. I'll do it faster this time. That's just dumb, right? But you'll remember that because that's so dumb, right? You can't see yourself. Even when I look in the mirror, that's not really me. There's a time difference, plus it's reversed, etc. So, you know, if I'm looking at myself in the mirror and then I try to, well, I don't shave, you know that. But if I try to like take my scissors and cut like those annoying hairs that are, you know, like snagly out of your nose, you know, and you're trying to go, they're not where you think they are. They're always on the other side somehow, and yet not. It's pretty weird, right? So we have left and right disorientation, which is fun, especially when you get people with selfies that take a picture of themselves in the bathroom, and then their shirt is backwards. So whatever their shirt says, it's like in reverse. You know how that works, right? Oddly though, how come when I'm looking at the mirror and everything is reversed, my head isn't upside down? It's left and right orientation is reversed, but my head is still right side up.
I mean, why doesn't it reflect it at the same time?
Yeah, how come I'm not upside down?
I think it has to do with how your
Have you ever
left
wondered
side
about
of
this?
your left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. The right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. When you see something, your vision crosses them and then realigns them. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
So
What's
why?
to do with the
So
mirror?
the mirror,
But why doesn't it also?
Because it just reflects whatever it's like exactly what's in front of it. And you're seeing this side of
You're
your
from
face.
the Midwest.
No.
You said seeing instead of
Seeing.
seeing.
so
With
what
a
I
G, seeing. You're seeing. There's an app you can get. that
Well,
will
you
show
get the
you
idea
how
though
you see
that
it.
my argument is
that's
that it
not
negates
really
your
yourself.
brain's reassembly. So
Yeah.
do you see what I'm saying?
The main thing I'm trying to
You
point
gave
out
your
is
brain
it's not really
reassembly.
you. It's not like you can escape this dilemma. You're never going to actually see yourself or experience yourself, etc. So Hume gives us that problem, which is like,
I think it's called an enantiomer.
oh, there's even a word for it. Wow, of course there
What is it?
An enantiomer is a mirror image.
Huh. Mm-hmm.
It's from organic chemistry. Yeah. There's this.
If you open a spoon, they're upside down.
Because the convex.
If you have like a really clear spoon, like a really silver spoon,
You are upside
they're
down.
upside down.
But that's
There's a
because of the
podcast
shape.
you would
the-
like
yeah.
on enantiomers, and they talk about.
Can you email me the link?
Probably. It's on Abraham Lincoln and him parting his hair on the other side.
Last week I read an article about Da Vinci that they figured out from several pictures that were made of him, where he was like the individual, that his eyes had a peculiar characteristic that like 10% of people have that enabled him to see things flat and 3D
At the same
at
time.
the same time,
Hmm.
so that might be part of the reason why he could paint pictures that look the way they did.
Hmm.
Didn't he also like make his notes in the mirror image.
He was
in
left hand,
in his diagram.
and so when he wrote this way. Wait. But his letters were reversed.
Yeah, he was able to write like mirror image,
So,
so you'd need
yeah.
a mirror, but he could just do it as,
Yeah, because he always wrote that way.
Crazy.
that is cool.
There's a new biography on him too, which I started reading, but I
I
haven't,
bet.
haven't finished it yet. Oh, it's so interesting though. They're all so good. Yeah, it's not like that. It's the kind of book where once you put it down, you can't pick it back up.
Mhm.
You know, there are some books like that. However, so you can't actually see yourself. So all we can actually experience is phenomena. And by the way, God is like that too for Kant. We can't actually experience God because God has to exist, otherwise morality makes no sense. Although, remember, Kant's the one that argues that the arguments for the existence of God fail. Right? He accepts Hume's critique of the cosmological argument and the teleological argument, you know, which basically says, you know, there had to be a designer, and Kant, and David Hume says, prove it. And it's like, oh, that's not really a proof, is it? It isn't, actually, right? And the cosmological proof isn't either, and you know, then you know, the ontological argument, you know, if you don't like that one, you could just discard that one too. So basically, you could do away with all of the proofs if you're of a mind to. I disagree. I think the ontological argument is just so neat, you know. So there. However, nonetheless, for Kant, God must exist. Otherwise, morality is pointless, right? That's his argument. And by the way, that seems to actually work because if there is a value, even if it's like, should we eat at McDonald's or Burger King? And you can decide one or the other, right? Well, then you must have had a higher value at that moment. Maybe it's proximity, price, your favorite burger or whatever, and so you made a decision. But you're making a decision based on a set of values, and you have a value that's higher, so you went to this one instead of that one. So any valuative system has to be hierarchical, best worst, right? Might change over time for you, of course. That's maturity again, right? But nonetheless, there has to be a direction to it, and in a sense, well, if this is best, then you could extrapolate and say there's a best, whatever, largest pizza, a best pizza, you know, etc., right?
Best Oreo?
Best Oreo.
Impossible.
Well, you know, if you can decide which Oreo to buy in the store with hundreds of choices now. I'm not going to buy the sardine Oreo flavor, no.
There's a pepper shark.
There isn't one, I checked. There isn't.
It's just out of the question. My cats would like them. I don't have cats, but in fact, one of the reasons I don't have cats is because Disney made me hate cats when I was a little kid.
Was it the "We are Siamese if you
Exactement,
please"?
monsieur.
Yeah.
Exactement.
I love that short little video. I mean, I don't know, I love that song. It's so cute, it's so wonderful.
Cats were just depicted as so evil.
Yeah, but that's a fairy tale. It's fake, it's not real, and it's cute.
Aristocats.
The Aristocats
Yes,
are kind of
that's
cool.
the one, yeah.
I'm Tom O'Malley, the Owly Cat,
Yeah.
you know, but. So, and there's lots of cat things, you know, the way the cats, you know, are portrayed on Facebook, of course. Guaranteed to make you hate cats.
No. It's
They're
adorable.
cute until they Well, look at the comics. The cat is, depicted always as the miserable,
That's just
Get
part
Fuzzy.
of an
Get Fuzzy
ongoing
is-
record of persecution and
why does that
anti-feline
guy have that
discrimination.
cat? It's just, the cat's like just constantly selling tickets to the apartment, it's just ridiculous. Okay, so God must exist, or morality doesn't exist, so there has to be values. Thing in itself must exist, self must exist. Thing is, we can't see any of those because they're not phenomena, but we can transcend this limitation. So Kant's answer is transcendentalism. You can transcend this limit and assume what must be the case. And that is the a priori, the synthetic a priori of things that must be the case. And one of the things that must be there, part of the a priori, synthetic experience, is that time must exist. I can't experience anything unless time is proceeding. Try it, see if you can. I know there's a book that's absolutely weird, interesting weird, and that is Alan Lightman, Einstein's dreams, which aren't really dreams that Einstein had, but instead Alan Lightman imagining all sorts of different ways that time behaves. So each chapter is a different way that time behaves. They're very weird. But so time must exist, and everything we experience in time. And along with time, we also must have space. If we're experiencing things, like say this, I can't imagine an object without it taking up space. And by the way, the time for Kant and the space, and this is pretty much accepted today. We're all Kantians at least. Comes from me. Time is not part of the phenomena. Time comes from my being myself and projecting my conception of time on my experience. And the same thing with space. The reason this occupies space is because I project it there. So for example, he does this with an orange, but you can imagine it with this. I never bring an orange for this occasion, but if you imagine the space that this takes up, and now keep your mind on the space that it takes up, even though I remove that. Notice you could still imagine that space, right? So notice, does that prove that space is my projection and not dependent on the objects? So space is not part of the phenomena, it's part of the way I kind of project my experience of everything that's going around me. And then I have these categories of understanding and judgment that break up everything else that I experience. So, I want Kant, categories. This is what makes it categorical. So for example, I experience everything in quantity. Everything in quantity. And by the way, this is a total flip of Aristotle, because Aristotle said everything has substance, quantity, quality, etc., all these categories. But for Aristotle, the categories were characteristics of the objects themselves. For Kant, these are characteristics that we project on our experience. So the reason that everything has quantity and quality, quality, remember, is positive, negative, right? The reason everything has all these characteristics is not because the phenomena actually has them, although they do, but they do because our way of experiencing the world projects these characteristics on them. So everything is one thing, but everything has many parts. It's not a contradiction in the object. The Greeks considered that an aporia, a problem that they couldn't solve. How could it be both one and many? Because they were thinking it's the object that has those characteristics. Well, the thing is, everything has those characteristics not because they do, but because we project those kinds of characteristics on them. For us, everything can be a single object. And everything has parts, because that's the way we experience them, right? As well as all the other categories of the understanding. Now, this is the way Kant describes it. It doesn't stay that way. Following Kant, it becomes a matter of trying to understand how this kind of schema develops in us. Is it biological? Do I perceive the world because of my biology this way, a common human biology? Well, to some extent, yes. We do have certain characteristics the same as all other humans, the way our eyes work, etc., right? The kind of hearing ability we have is relatively the same, etc. Although, of course, there's all sorts of interesting discrepancies depending on cultures and people and so on. Chinese speakers can learn to hear certain nuances in their language that if you don't learn it when you're young enough, you're never going to learn it, apparently. That's kind of interesting. But suffice it to say that this is eventually going to become language and culture. So it's not just going to be the Kantian categories of understanding, but it becomes the way we understand and project our experience on things comes from our language or culture, your individual vocabulary that you've learned from your peers, your parents, etc. So that's, of course, where we're at. But you see, what's important here is how Hume forced this issue, and Kant was the one that solved it, which brought us into the point of view that human beings experience things not because that's the way they are, but because of the way human beings are raised to experience things. And that comes really from our culture. Kant didn't get all the way there yet, but he's a stepping stone on that path, right? Is this fun? I need a second quiz question, though.
You don't have to, actually. You don't have to.
But it's fun. If you're appointed to run an agency or a department in the government, but you have no idea what that agency does, and your sole thinking is that all government is bad, so this agency is bad, so my main job is to go in there and fire as many people as I can. You get the idea? Is this a good way to run an agency?
So you think it's bad?
Okay, so
You have no idea what it does, but you think it's bad, and so you want to fire everybody?
Well,
What's I don't understand the
okay. So here's
if you are appointed to
so this is Michael Lewis, The Fifth Risk. For example, when Trump was elected, he had no transition team. He did actually. He had, assigned Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, volunteer. They're friends, and he knew that legally Trump had to have a transition team ready in case he was elected. So he convinced Trump that he ought to start, and so he started it. He got the offices that were offered by the government for the transition team. Both parties get the office space, etc. So he started actually selecting people that were knowledgeable for all the different positions that Trump was going to have to supply, right? He was going to have to hire all these people to go into their positions, right? When Trump saw that Christie had used $2 million of the campaign funds to pay, because you have to pay these people that you're bringing in, they're working. And you're the ones that have to pay them. And you can pay them from the campaign funds, but of course if you're using campaign funds to pay these people for the transition team, that money you can't spend on the actual campaign. And Trump is of course thinking of just trying to spend all his money to get elected and not spend it on other things. So when he found out that Christie had spent $2 million on this project, he was furious. He said, "You're stealing my money." You know, he didn't want to spend any money. So the end result was that once the Trump won, starting on day one, he fired Chris Christie and all of the men and people, you know, that he had hired for trans. So basically, starting on, you know, knowing that he was the president-elect, he had no transition team. And didn't have anyone to really start picking people, right? So he ended up picking people that hated the departments to get rid of them. You know, so like Voss is against education, not education in general, but she had criticisms of the Department of Education, and basically she's been trying to prune it of all of its power since she's been picked, right?
Well, considering what a dismal failure it is, maybe that's a good thing, who knows?
Well, now that's the alternative argument that, you know, in corporations,
Devil's
when you
advocate.
buy a corporation, like Jared Kushner went into the White House and saw all these staffers getting their stuff together to move out. And he was shocked because he thought they would be all staying. Because he thought it was like a corporation, you know, when you take over the corporation is all still there, and you just come in now and you're the head of it. He didn't realize that all these people were packing up and going to leave. You know, they were all Obama's people, and they were going to leave. And so there was like nobody to fill in all these spots, and so it was a real shock to them. But corporations do this, apparently. And it's a good thing because it gets rid of, you know, corporations and bureaucracies in general tend to grow. You know, it seems like the main point of a bureaucracy is that it grows the bureaucracy. There's all kinds of fun things called Parkinson's law. You've heard of these things. The work expands so as to fill the time available for its complete. You know, so there's actually books. It's a book actually. I don't know.
That seems like just a fancy way of saying, you know, idle hands on the government playground.
It was originally associated with the British, the Navy. The Navy kept growing, so they ended up with more admirals than they had ships eventually. The bureaucracy tended to grow.
That's crazy.
However,
So the question is, if you are appointed to run a government agency, but don't know what the agency does, but assume it's bad, so you want to fire everybody, what? Then what's the rest of the question? I'm a little lost on what the question actually is.
Well, I mean, if Kant says that the way we perceive the world is based on our categories of understanding, and the person doesn't understand the point of the agency, like the Department of Energy, the guy comes in and he thinks it's bad, because the main reason he thinks the Department of Energy is there is because they want to control the way businesses use energy. But that's false. That's not all that the Department of Energy does. For example, they're also in charge of nuclear weapons. You kind of need someone in charge of those. Yes? Nuclear weapons? You've heard of
Yes.
those?
Yeah.
We need somebody to like be in charge of those. That's not like bad. You have to have that, right?
Right.
So
Useless trivia for the day. Do you know one of the duties of the U.S. Marshals is to provide armed escort and security for nuclear materials?
Nope, didn't know that.
U.S. Marshals.
One of those weird things that evolved
Yeah.
because of who was available. at
Somebody's
the
got to
time,
do it.
and that became their job. And so things like the Department of Energy are complex. It takes people years to find out what they all do. So if you're just coming in and your cultural understanding of the agency is such that it's bad and then we want to get rid of it. Government is bad. We want to get rid of it. So someone had to be appointed, so I'm appointed, but I'm coming in primarily to find out who of you think that global warming is our fault. I'm going to fire you for that. Thinking, I mean, that was like the question. The new head of the Department of Energy came in, and his first concern was not learning what the Department of Energy was, but was to find out who, do a poll and find out who thinks global warming is humans' fault.
I'm still confused about what the question is.
Figure
I've
that
got. If you are appointed to run a government agency, but
Is it
don't
going to be
understand
good?
what the
Is
agency
it going to be
does.
good for the agency?
Oh, okay.
If the person who's in charge of the agency doesn't know what the agency does?
Okay, so if you are appointed to run a government agency but don't understand what the agency does, is it good for the agency? Of course not.
Which is the point of this book.
You should never have hate without understanding that which you allege to hate. Otherwise,
It
it's
seems
just
like,
stupid and
it
ignorant.
seems like you really ought to learn what the agency.
How can you say that you don't like
It's
something when you don't know what it is? How can you?
My daughter seems to do that all the time. Every time I
With
feed her
vegetables, for
food.
example?
Anything. She's
So
like,
Chris-
Mom, I'm always changing with every day.
Okay, so that is the reason, by the way, why I own a copy of the Communist Manifesto, which I have read and studied extensively, and why I own a copy of Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, which, by the way, was extremely difficult and expensive to get a good English translation of. So,
Don't we have any in the library?
yeah, but my wife bought me a copy of my own for a present once. So, and she said it was actually a special
I
order
had
and
that
very
happen
expensive.
with Donna. She asked me, "What do you want for your birthday?" I said,
And
"Oh,
you
you
s-
pick it."
And you said Mao Zedong's Little Red Book?
No, I said, "You pick it." The birthday present. You
Huh.
pick it. And so she got me a You Pick dictionary.
Oh my gosh, really?
It's huge and red and very interesting, actually.
Huh.
Did you know that they have a word for he took off his pants? It's a verb. He took off his pants. They also have a verb for she took off his pants.
Well, that's handy.
Do you remember the words?
No, I can't.